Hi, I'm Amrita. I'm back again with yet another interesting lesson on mass communication. However, this time we are going to look at the subject of mass communication from the other side. In other words, in this lesson, we are going to explore the nature and composition of the mass communication audience. In simple terms, what we mean by mass communication audience is a group of people who are receiving or have received a particular mass communication message. To say that the audience is the most important part of the mass communication process will definitely not be an exaggeration. In fact, without the audience, there is no purpose in mass communication. No media business can exist without content that attracts consumers or audiences. When mass media personnel speak of their audience, they mean the people to whom they are directing their products. Media practitioners or the people who select or create the material that a mass media firm produces, distributes, or exhibits are keenly aware that the kinds of content that they produce or exhibit must be attractive to audiences. That is the only way to ensure that money will flow their way and not towards their competitors. There is no doubt that the audience is the most critical source of mass media revenue. If there is no audience to purchase books and movie tickets, subscribe to newspapers and magazines, and listen to radio and TV programs, no mass medium could stay in business. No viewership would mean no advertisement, and no advertisement would mean no revenue. Since creating mass media content is an expensive business, getting audience to watch it is of prime importance. In some cases, all the members of the audience are paying attention to the medium at the same time. For example, the television audience that tuned in just after the 9/11-2001 debacle. Thousands of people watched live as the World Trade Center came crashing down and the resultant chaos and tragedy. In other cases, the attention of the audience is stretched out over time. For instance, the audience for a particular magazine may consist of people who read copies of the magazine at various times over the period of a month or more. And in some other cases, the interest of the audience may be spread over a very long period of time. The audience for Satyajit Ray's movies, for example, is very large. And even today, decades later, we still enjoy watching his movies. The composition of the audience is also determined by the character and content of the mass medium. Magazines and journals with a specific mandate, for example, the magazine Interiors Exteriors or Lensight, the FTII journal, will be subscribed only by a highly specific audience segment. Similarly, TV programs or channels focusing on specific themes and subjects are designed to appeal to a firmly identified demographic group. For example, the Toppers channel broadcasts programs mainly suited for children between the age of 15 and 18 years. Similarly, ET Today is a channel with a viewership quite different from the viewership that channel MTV can garner. So the audience composition is greatly defined by the subject matter of the mass medium. By nature, mass communication audience has four atypical features. We can list them as 1. The audience of mass communication is always large. 2nd, the audience is normally heterogeneous. 3rd, the audience is characterized as anonymous. And 4th, the audience is considered simultaneous. The large character of the audience of mass communication makes it very difficult to direct mass communication messages to specific audience or a group of people. This presupposes the fact that messages that undergo mass communication process must be directed to very many people, like the ones sent through the mass media of radio, TV, newspapers, and so on. It must be pointed out that messages meant for very few people or particular individuals are not regarded as mass communication. For instance, a letter sent from a mother to her son, a GSM conversation or a conference call between two or more people, or telegrams do not belong to the mass communication family. This is mainly because such messages can be classified as either one-to-one or one-to-few, as against mass communication, which is one-to-many. By heterogeneous, we mean mass communication messages cannot be isolated. It cannot be directed towards certain people while others are debarred from it. Every human being, irrespective of age, creed, sex, wealth, and affluence, can receive the messages at the same time. In other words, mass communication messages are available to all. The messages are not restricted to people from any position or class. It is for all who wish to access it. When we characterize the mass communication audience as anonymous, we mean these messages are not for sending to a particular address. Similarly, mass communication messages sent via a medium are not directed towards a particular person or name. It is addressed in general and available to all of whom it may concern. In other words, unlike in other forms of communication, in mass communication, the person for whom the message is created is not physically known to the sender. There is neither a face nor any particular knowledge of the receiver available with the sender. It is assumed that messages in mass communication are sent to nobody, everybody, and somebody. Simultaneity of mass communication audience indicates that mass communication messages are exposed to the audience at the same time or simultaneously. However, even though the message is available at the same time to the audience, some amongst them might decide not to consume the message almost immediately. The audience might delay his exposure to such messages for different reasons. This is especially the case when the medium of the message is the print media. For example, a reader might decide not to read the pages of a book almost immediately after publication. The same way, someone might delay reading the daily newspaper soon after it is delivered early in the morning. He may postpone the reading till bedtime. Hence, the simultaneity in mass communication audience is mostly applicable to messages sent via the broadcast media. But the fact is that everybody is exposed to such messages instantaneously. These points led some early critics of the media to come up with the idea of media audience as masses. According to many theorists, particularly in the early history of the subject, when we listen to our CDs or sit in the cinema, we become part of a mass audience in many ways, like a crowd at a football match or a rock concert. But at the same time, very different because separated from all the other members of this mass by space and sometimes time. If you look at the early history of the media, it is fairly easy to see where the idea of a mass audience came from. Within less than 100 years, photography, film, radio, and television were all invented. Each one of them allowed works of art or pieces of entertainment which might once have been restricted to the number of people who could fit into an art gallery or a theatre to be transmitted in exactly the same form to enormous numbers of people in different parts of the world. These media quickly became extremely popular, and at the same time there was an important difference between them and older forms of entertainment. Whereas in the past many forms of entertainment were only available to those who could afford them, now suddenly films and radio, particularly were available to all. Early media theorists struggled to understand this and found it easiest to compare the media audience with the kinds of crowds they were used to from the world before the media. They came up with the idea of the mass audience. Here is how the sociologist Herbert Boomer described it in 1950. First, its membership may come from all walks of life and from all distinguishable social strata. It may include people of different class, position, of different vocation, of different cultural attainment, and of different wealth. Secondly, the mass is an anonymous group, or more exactly, is composed of anonymous individuals. Bloomer means anonymous in the sense that unlike the citizens of earlier communities, the people who are members of the mass audience for the media do not know each other. Third, there exists little interaction or change of experience between members of the mass. They are usually physically separated from one another, and being anonymous do not have the opportunity to mill as do members of the crowd. Fourth, the mass is very loosely organized and is not able to act with the resoluteness or unity of a crowd. Bloomer was writing about the media in 1950, 5 years after the Second World War. During the war and before it, Hitler in Germany and Stalin in Russia had attempted to use the media as propaganda. Through films, radio and poster art, they had attempted to persuade mass audiences to follow their policies and believe in their ideologies. Because of this, to the critics of the time, the media seemed like a dangerous weapon. In the wrong hands, they felt the media was capable of persuading millions to follow evil men and disturbing doctrines. This was especially because during this time, the notion of the mass society tended to emphasize audience as a collective of somewhat passive, inert individuals, highly susceptible to mass-mediated messages. It was supposed that members of the audience believed whatever they read in the newspapers or heard on the radio. They often did not exercise their own minds. People were seen as highly vulnerable to media manipulation. The earliest theories of mass communication were based on this supposition. Their theories imagined that mass media could have instantaneous society-wide influence on even the most educated, thoughtful people. This was recognized for the first time. Scholars and researchers in the area came to realize that mass communication had a far-reaching and pervasive effect on the audience. The mass media messages were directed, pointed, and extremely influential. This influence was described as the magic bullet theory of communication. The magic bullet theory, or the hypodermic needle theory, shaped in the 1920s, holds that media broadcasts directly influence the opinions and the actions of viewers. The mass media had direct, immediate, and a powerful effect on their audiences. The theory was a propaganda theory produced by a combination of behaviorist and Freudian schools of thought. Behaviorism held that human action was either as a result of or in response to external environmental stimuli. It argued that the so-called consciousness that was meant to rationalize behaviors did so, but only after they were triggered by the external stimuli. Freudianism saw the self that controls human action as having three parts: the ego, the rational mind, id, the pleasure-seeking part of the mind, and superego, the internalized set of cultural rules. It said the human action was often the product of the darker side of the self, the id, which is the pleasure-seeking part of the mind. By appealing to the id so that it could fight and overcome the ego, propagandists ensured the effectiveness of their propagandas. In fact, the magic bullet theory assumed what behaviorism was never able to adequately demonstrate. External stimuli like those conveyed through mass media can condition anyone to behave in whatever way a master propagandist wanted. People were viewed as powerless to consciously resist manipulation. No matter what their social status or their education were, the magic bullets of propaganda penetrate their defenses and transform their thoughts and actions. In the magic bullet theory, the rational mind is a mere facade, incapable of resisting powerful messages. People have no ability to screen out or criticize these messages. The media-generated messages have the ability to penetrate to their subconscious minds and transform how they think and feel. A classic example of the application of the magic bullet theory was illustrated on October 30, 1938, when Orson Welles and the newly formed Mercury Theatre group broadcasted the radio edition of H.G. Wells' War of the Worlds. On the eve of Halloween, as a scary joke, the radio edition was interrupted with a news bulletin. The audience was informed that Martians had begun an invasion of Earth in a place called Grover's Mill in New Jersey.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. From the Meridian Room in the Park Plaza Hotel in New York City, we bring you the music of Raymond Raquello and his orchestra. With a touch of the Spanish, Raymond Raquello leads off with La Capacita.
Ladies and gentlemen, we interrupt our program of dance music to bring you a special bulletin from the Intercontinental Radio News. At 20 minutes before 8 Central Time, Professor Farrell of the Mount Jennings Observatory, Chicago, Illinois, reports observing several explosions of incandescent gas occurring at regular intervals on the planet Mars. The spectroscope indicates the gas to be hydrogen and moving toward the Earth with enormous velocity. Professor Pearson of the observatory at Princeton confirms Farrell's observation and describes the phenomenon as, quote, like a jet of blue flame shot from a gun, unquote. We now return you to the music of Raymond Raquello, playing for you in the Meridian Room of the Park Plaza Hotel, situated in downtown New York.
It became known as the panic broadcast and changed broadcast history forever. Approximately 12 million people in the United States heard the broadcast, and about 1 million of those actually believed that a serious alien invasion was underway. A wave of mass hysteria disrupted households, interrupted religious services, caused traffic jams, and clogged communication systems. People fled their city homes to seek shelter in more rural areas, raided grocery stores, and began to ration food. The nation was in a state of chaos, and this broadcast was the cause of it. Media theorists have classified the War of the Worlds broadcast as the most representative example of the magic bullet theory. This is exactly how the theory worked. By injecting the message directly into the psyche of the public, the media message attempted to create a uniform thinking. The effects of the broadcast suggested that the media could manipulate a passive and gullible public, leading theorists to believe this was one of the primary ways media authors shaped audience perception. According to the theory, the media is like a syringe which injects ideas, attitudes, and beliefs into the audience, who, as a powerless mass, have little choice but to be influenced. In other words, if you watch something violent, you may go and do something violent. If you see a woman being abused on TV, you will want to do the same yourself, believing that there was nothing wrong in that. Confirming that sexual and violent content can affect the most vulnerable of audience groups. This theory has been particularly popular when people have been considering violence in films. There have been films such as Straw Dogs and The Evil Dead which have been banned partly because of a belief that they might encourage people to copy the crimes within them.
What the hell?
In 2004, the documentary Final Solution, which looks at religious rioting between Hindus and Muslims, was banned. The film followed the 2002 clashes in the western state of Gujarat, which left more than 1,000 people dead. The censor board justified the ban, saying it was highly provocative and may trigger off unrest and communal violence. The ban was lifted in October 2004 after a sustained campaign. A 9-year-old child recently hanged himself while trying to copy a stunt shown in Khatron Ke Khiladi. Sure, the media does influence the mind, and there may be some copycat crimes, but on the other hand, there is very little evidence to show that each and everyone watching a program will be affected by its contents in the same way. Out of the millions watching the same program or film, a few may act on it passively without processing the data. Though the magic bullet theory is no longer considered valid, it was a building block in media theory and contributed to the development of more complex ideas. One of the first pieces of evidence that the magic bullet theory was too simplistic surprisingly came to light during research that was conducted post Orson Welles' famous Mercury Theatre of the Air Martian Invasion radio broadcast in 1938. According to the theory, anyone who listened to the broadcast should have believed that invaders from the planet Mars had landed in southern New Jersey. Yet, although many did believe it, most did not. And the ways in which they came to not believing were very interesting. Some listeners switched channels to see if the news was being carried elsewhere. Some picked up the phone and called friends to see if they were listening, and if so, to ask what they thought about it. Some paid enough critical attention to the show to recognize that it was fiction. Hence, studies that followed the Martian invasion broadcast began to focus on the fact that members of the audience also engaged in face-to-face communication with family and friends. Theorists hypothesized that certain members of the audience, called opinion leaders, are normally more influential than other members. In theory, the opinion leaders would define as to what the media messages actually meant and then further tell their friends and neighbors. It was clear from these responses that most people did not accept the media message at face value. Rather, they took it under consideration and sought the truth by talking it over with their families and friends. Jeremy Campbell summarizes this result. The bullet theory assumed that an audience was passive, waiting for the media to shoot a propaganda message into it, and would roll over in a state of docile surrender when hit, as long as the bullet was sufficiently powerful. Accordingly, researchers did not bother to study the audience. Instead, they analyzed the content of the messages, assuming that content was the secret of a successful propaganda bullet. However, the researchers were due for a surprise. The audience obstinately declined to fall under the spell of the messages. Sometimes they reacted in ways that were opposite to the propagandist's intentions, or enjoyed the bombardment without allowing it to change their opinions in the slightest. Within 20 years of the infamous Martian invasion broadcast, the way researchers looked at mass media was radically altered. Media was no longer feared as instruments of political manipulation and oppression, but instead it was considered as a relatively benign force with much potential for social good. it came to be argued that mass communication generally does not have a one-on-one impact on people as suggested by the magic bullet theory. Often the impact is indirect and impersonal. So the influence was not as powerful as was initially thought to be. This thought gave rise to the limited effects theory or the indirect effects theory. Some key generalizations about the role of media in society emerged from the limited effects research work conducted between 1945 and 1960. 1. The media rarely influences people directly. Most people are sheltered from direct propaganda manipulation by their family, friends, colleagues and social circle. The audience normally does not believe the media blindly. They turn to others for advice and critical interpretation. This assumption contradicts the mass society notion that views people as isolated and hence highly susceptible to media manipulation. Second, by the time most people become adults, they normally would have developed strongly held group commitments. This could be loyalty towards a political party or some religious affiliation. Such group associations nearly always create a strong barrier that media messages are often unable to break. These commitments cause people to reject messages that are not conducive to the ideologies of the groups that they are members of. Media use tends to be consistent with these commitments. For example, voters with BJP affiliations normally subscribe to literature coming out of the BJP fold and hence pay attention to mainly what BJP politicians have to say through the TV or the radio. Third, even when media effects do occur, they will be modest and isolated. Huge number of people across the country and continent will not be converted. Rather, small pockets of individuals may be influenced. These are usually people who are cut off from other people and whose group commitments are not so strong. Fourth, research has confirmed there is normally a two-step flow of media influence. Media can manipulate people if only they succeed in influencing key opinion leaders of the society first. These opinion leaders are generally sophisticated and critically review all media messages. Since they are not easily influenced by media content, they act as a barrier to media influence. So this brings us to the end of today's lesson. Not only have we studied some audience theories in this lesson, but also explored some typical characteristics that identify the mass media audience and the features that distinguish audience from mass media audience. Thank you and goodbye.